All right. So in regards to this version of the scene where I added all the stuff on the ground, um, it is pretty much identical to the previous scene. So actually, I'm at what I've opened right now is Onyx Trees B10, and then I've finally changed the name to Overgrowth just because, just wanted to be clear with myself. And so right now what I have open is this guy. And the things that have changed in here is I've obviously added a whole bunch of ivy on the ground. And this is obviously unrelated to Onyx. This is created with IvyGen, which is a free tool. And so if I go in here, let me see if I changed anything on the shader on the ground. Hypershade. I did. And so I created my layered shader. And so this is the layered shader for the highway. And let's go to Photoshop real quick. Let's close that out. And let's go back to finding the renders. Projects, highway, images, that guy, and that guy. Copy, close, paste. All right. So in this render, where everything's clean, and then we compare this to this, aside from some color correction differences, you can see that all of the trees and their placement is identical. So I didn't change anything with the shaders or anything with the trees. The only thing I changed is that this tree right here, I decided to put my avocado leaf textures on it. So for whatever reason, just to break things up a little bit. And then obviously the shader for the highway changed, and I added the ivy and I added the sign. So for the shader for the highway, it's a layered texture. And so the two textures that are layered on top of each other, if we go into Maya, are my regular highway texture, as well as this texture, which is path color B. And then this one is road damage. So if I go in here and I open those, so let's go to source images. Here's the normal road. And here's the damaged one. So it's pretty much identical. I just felt that with the layered texture of dirt on top of it, it looked weird to have these lines be so perfect. And so I just used the clone tool and just very quickly just broke up the edges a little bit. So it's pretty lazy. It doesn't look good this way, but it works fine in the layered shader. So I just broke that up a little bit. And so obviously when I say clone tool, I just mean like literally clone tool. So just grab and just start breaking it up. And so, and for the clone tool, I'm just using a brush that has a, it's one of the presets. So brush presets, instead of using a round brush, I'm using one of these, which are useful. I forget exactly which one I'm using. I think it's one of, actually, I think it's that one. So, but it's just a quick way to break it up. And then the other texture that's in here is this one. And so this texture is really high res. So this road, as we know, is 4K by 4K, while this texture is also 4K by 4K, but I repeated it a bit in Maya. So if I go in here, my highway texture is repeated once in V and 11 times in U. So just repeating that road along my geometry. While this path texture is also repeated 11 times in U, but twice in V. And so since it's a 4K texture, if I repeat it 2 times, that means that I have 8K worth of texture information going across my road here. So that makes it nice and high res. And So this texture is a combination of two different textures that I've just blended together and made tileable. So it's something that is important to do. And if I zoom into it at 100%, we can kind of obviously see the blend points. And these textures probably come from CG Textures or myang.com, or I'm not sure exactly where I grabbed them from. But just breaking it up between sort of cracked earth and pebbly earth inside here. So this texture is repeated 2 by 11, and this texture is repeated 1 by 11, and then this one is layered on top of this one. And so if I look in Hypershade again, and I graph it, then what I've done is I created one MIA material for the highway, which doesn't have bump spec or anything, so it just didn't need it. And then I have another shader for the dirt, which we can see I'm doing my typical thing where I'm pumping the color through a remap node, which then gets put into spec and bump. So I have two MIA materials, and with both of them, since they're meant to be dirt as opposed to a leaf, I have the roughness up at 0.2 and the glossiness is very low at 0.2. And then my BRDF is very low, 0.05 and 0.3. So it's not very reflective. So, and then my reflectivity is obviously connected, or my reflection color is connected to the spec map. So not very reflective. And then the way that I layered them is you can see I'm using a fractal to control the layering. And so this fractal is basically the mask that controls how one is appearing on top of the other. And the way that I created my layered shader with Mental Ray is I use what's called a MIB color interpolate node. And that node you can find under Mental Ray. And it's in here somewhere there. Data conversion, MIB color interpolate. So you just create that node and you get this. And so what I have is I have the result of one of the materials, the highway, going into color 0. And then I have the result of my dirt shader going into color 1. And then my fractal is outputting its out alpha into input. So the input is basically the mask. And then that gives me my layered material that then needs to be assigned to the surface. And you can't assign an MIB color interpolate node to your surface. So I connected the out value of the color interpolate node to the color of a surface shader, the out color. And then that surface shader can get assigned to my road. So that's a very easy way to do a layered shader in Maya with Mental Ray without using plugins. The only other thing that I also do in here is on the shading group for the surface shader, I connect the message from one of my MIA materials to the shadow shader slot. So if I go in here and go to the shading group and go to Mental Ray, you need to have a shadow shader connected. And so I just have one of the materials, doesn't matter which one, connected to the shadow shader. And that's much more important when you have cutout opacity. But either way, that's what's going on. So result connected to color, out alpha connected to input. And then if you're using out alpha as the connection, then on the fractal, it's important under color balance to make sure that alpha is luminance. So the luminance of these values in the fractal is what generates the alpha, because the out alpha is what's getting connected to input here. So by default that's off, and you're going to think that this technique isn't working. So just go in and make sure alpha is luminance is on, and then your fractal will work correctly as a mask. And so the end result of all that, let me close this, close that, is that I get this layered shader. So we can see the clean road is still underneath, just with a little breakup on the road stripes. And then I just am layering this dirt shader top of it. So that's what's going on. So in this scene, basically what I've done is I've created the shader, or the layered shader for the road, and I've created all the ivy. And for the ivy, it was just a matter of taking my NURB surface for my road, and since it's NURBS, I had to convert it to poly, triangulate it, export it as an OBJ, and import it into IvyGen, because IvyGen needs things that are triangulated. And with a NURB surface, obviously I can go to modify, convert NURBS to polygons, set up my conversion settings. These are actually the settings I used. So I said, give me quads, general, per span of isoparms, 2 in U, 20 in V. I could have said triangles since I knew this was going to go to IvyGen, but I did it as quads, obviously, because that's the last time I used this tool, and the settings are still in here. So I converted this NURB surface to polys, and then once that was done, then under polygons, I then triangulated it. And so that's under mesh triangulate. And so all that means is that if I then go to IvyGen and I import the road, which is there, highway poly, I can see there's my road. And so if I just go and there we go. And so with IvyGen, you just double click somewhere and grow your ivy. And then once you grow it, you create the ivy. But obviously I can change the ivy size, I can change the leaf size and how many leaves there are, make the branches way smaller, and just grow ivy on top of the road. Now obviously inside here it's kind of growing all over the place, and so I had to tweak the settings a bit to get what I wanted. And so every time I use IvyGen and I tweak the settings, let me just find something real quick. Here's my project. Once I find the settings that I like for my scene, I do a screen grab of the UI for IvyGen, and I just save it as a TIFF file. And so that way I can very easily remember what settings I liked for IvyGen. So if I go in here and I open IvyGen, I can now see, like, okay, my ivy size was 0.00, like really small, 0.001, basically. My primary weight, how much it keeps trying to go in the same direction, very, very high. My random weight, 0.647. My gravity weight, 0.197, because I don't need a lot of gravity since it's going along the road. My adhesion weight, 0.2. My branching probability, so the higher the number, the less branching you're going to get, because by default if you do this you're going to get a crazy amount of branching, so that really high, around there. Float length, how long a branch can be before, how far a branch can separate from the surface. So I kept that really low. Adhesion distance from the surface. Branch size 0.019. And you can't enter a value there, so I'm just getting it close. Leaf size 0.828. Leaf probability 0.765. And so that's kind of the settings. And so if I double click now and grow, then it's going to give me something that's not exactly what I want. And so now I just need to play with the settings a little bit. So I'm going to try and mess with the branching probability. Okay, so that's not it. This is IvyGen for you. Float length. There we go. So my float length was a little too low. So I'm going to now increase the branching probability up again. Okay, and now I can see I'm getting ivy and then birth it. And there you go. So I obviously did this a whole bunch of times on the road. To create my ivy. And so here my float length is way too high. So it's allowing it to get too far away from the surface. But that is how I created the ivy. So once you export it, you end up with an OBJ. And that you import. And then with the OBJ that comes in, it comes in with its own shaders. And so you can see, like, this is some of the shaders it comes in with. Obviously, you create your own ivy shader. So you can see I have an ivy leaf shader. And but what's useful about these shaders is it makes it easy to select the components, because ivy comes in as a single mesh. So the leaves and the branches are all combined. So you can separate them and recombine them into the separate elements, but that takes a while for me to calculate. So that works, and I did that for the longest time. But so now what I'm doing more often is just selecting the branches. So let's see, none of this actually has anything assigned, but let me just show you what I mean. If I import something from IvyGen, so let's go and just grab some of this ivy for the road. So there's a patch of ivy. So you can see that it's just a single mesh. And so, but if I go in here, I can see I have this shader, or these three shaders. And let's make these smaller. So I can take the one that's assigned to the branches, right-click, select objects with material. You'll see that it's going to select them. And then I could just go and delete the branches. So now I only have the leaves. And then now if I import that one again, which is IVJ, then on this guy, I'll select the leaves. It has two shaders for the leaves, just to randomize, and delete those leaves. So now this one is the leaves, and then this one, oops, I did it backwards. This one is just the leaves, but no branches, yeah. And then I need the branches. So import IVJ. So for this guy, I'll hide it. And then this one, we can see has the branches in there. So go to Hypershade. So select objects with material. So let's go and grab the one that I hid and just assign a Lambert shader and delete unused, so it's not so confusing in here. So on this mesh, if I select branches, you can see it selects those. And let me just go in here real quick and turn off soft mod. So let me just go 1 sec and turn that off. All right, God, I hate Maya sometimes. I just had, I obviously hit something at some point and had soft mod permanently on in my move tool. So underneath soft selection, so just had to turn it on. So now, if I right click and select object with material, I can see I have just the branches. So on this one, I can select the leaves, hit delete, and then on this shader, select the leaves, hit delete, and you can see now I have just the branches. And here, turn that on, is just the leaves. So this one's the leaves, this one's the branches, edit, group, and then there you go. And so that way I can assign a shader to the leaves and assign a shader to the branches. And then for the leaves, their UVs are all in 0 to 1. If I grab a leaf, as we can see. And so what I would want to do for the leaves is just put them with my DJX script into a 2x2. So that is Ivy. So if we go back, now let's go to the scene. and close that. I've taken all of my ivy that's inside here. I've put it on a display layer. So you can see for every single ivy group, I did what I just showed you. So I have the leaves and the branches separated, which I prefer to do from a shader perspective, because the branches I don't want to run the script on, my DJX script, but on the leaves I do. And so I made that separation for every single one of these. And then you can also see that I made some ivy on one of the trees. And this is actually one of the instance trees that's sitting right there. And so to figure that out, if I took my tree instancer node and make a geometry, since I had saved initial state on my particles, these trees always pop up in the same spot. And so you can see that my ivy lines up with that tree right there. So I just had to go and figure out which tree that was that was instanced, which didn't take very long, and then basically make a copy of that tree and move the trunk and the branches into that spot. So I would have an OBJ that I could export to IvyGen to grow ivy on the leaves, just because if we go back to Photoshop, in this render, before I had done that, this was bothering me right there, just that we could see those branches and they were so clean. And so I just decided to go in and add a little ivy, which of course I've graded this thing so much we can't see it. But if I open the render that's ungraded, so that's this guy. Then in here we can see the ivy that I added on that branch. So really subtle, but at the time it seemed important. So I added some ivy with IvyGen onto the ground. I added some ivy on the tree, and I created that texture and that layered shader. So if I move on through these different saves, really what's going to be changing is just me messing around with the shader on the ivy, the shader on the ground, and I added a little street sign. So I don't know if that's going to be in here. Oh, I can see what changed in here. In here, I imported my eucalyptus trees. And those are right there. Those I imported as geometry and then just placed them as opposed to instancing them. Because when I looked at this render, I just wanted to fill something in the upper right corner there. And so just adding those trees, it's subtle, but it's something. It's just more of a compositional decision. And like I said, I already had these trees sitting around from another scene. And so I just imported them right in. They already had shaders and textures. And then 04. And my scene file size, just so you know, is around 700 megs, just because I have a few million polys in here. But that's not a big deal. And, oh, now I've got the road sign. So, road sign is obviously something I made in a separate scene, just because it was easier. So, sign. I made a road sign. So nothing exciting there, other than the fact that I did all the little holes as geometry using a Boolean. I very rarely use Booleans, but I didn't want to deal with making a shader with cutout opacity that has a repeating circle going all the way up the middle. And so I just got lazy and did it with a Boolean. So I just made a cylinder and duplicated it going up and Booleaned it. And that gave me that. So if I turn on wireframe unshaded, I can see this geometry. And then this was just a polyplane that I rotated and extruded and smoothed. And then I made this texture. This texture I made from scratch in Photoshop. That's on the sign. And so I just did a Google search for this kind of sign, so I could eyedrop the color. That's standard for these kinds of signs. And then just made the line and painted the graphic. You can see I didn't paint it very well. You can kind of see it's a little wonky. I just used the brush tool to paint that. I put the little bolts in the textures, and then I just grabbed a random dirt map, a black and white dirt map from my texture library, and just multiplied it on top. And this is MIA material, as is this. So again, I'm only using MIA materials. So if I go into Hypershade, I can see the MIA material for the steel. So here I have a solid gray color for the color. And then I have this dirt map that's being used on spec to break up the specular highlight of my MIA material. And then for the signpost, I can see I've got my color map going into diffuse, and then the dirt map that I multiplied on top of my texture there, I saved that out of Photoshop just by itself and put that into reflection color to break up the spec to make it look weathered. And so that gave me my sign. So in this scene, I did make a physical sun and physical sky just so I could check or test out my shader for that. So nothing exciting. I've got my little reference 180 centimeter tall cube so that I know this is a 6 foot tall person, so I have an idea of scale while I'm modeling this thing, which I do a lot. So just good to have reference. And then I just grouped the sign together and exported it as an MB, so it exports with its shaders, and imported it into here. So let's now move on to 06. And once I had that sign in the scene, I decided I also wanted to grow some ivy up the sign. So I triangulated the sign, exported that as an OBJ, and imported that into IvyGen. And so you can see in this scene, I have now imported the ivy for that sign. So if I look through another camera, I can see some ivy that's growing up this sign. Let's turn off the grass. So obviously you can see the point where I double clicked on the back of the sign. So it would kind of grow up the back and give me a few leaves crawling over the top. And then just a bunch of ivy growing up the top of this thing, and a silly floating leaf right there, which, whatever. And so if I look through our render cam, now I have my road sign with some ivy on it, and that's what changed in here. So my next render, or rather save, is what I rendered from. And so I can see I've got 07, 07 fog, and 07 Z depth. And so this is for rendering my beauty pass. And so if I open 07, that means that this scene is going to have initial state set on the particles. It's going to have a particle disk cache, and everything's ready to render. And I only rendered a still of this scene because I just made this yesterday, so I haven't had time to render an animation of it yet. Basically, initial state saved on all the particles, and then I rendered this out at 4K. And for that, on my camera, on the physical sky node, I turn on use background so that the sky does not render. It just renders as black, and that gives me a good alpha channel for compositing. And then that's it. And then everything's ready to render. And so my render settings at 4K were basically 4000 by 2251. Under quality, I had it at 2, and Mitchell 4.4. Under ray tracing, I did my render with 2.10.20. So it does 2 reflection bounces and high refractions and trace depth for all the translucency. And then for final gather, the 4K render, I used 150.5 and 30. So with filter at 1 and 224 for reflections, refractions, and trace depth. So we talked about this stuff earlier. So again, my test render settings for final gather are 50.1 and 30. But for final rendering, the higher your accuracy and point density, the more detail you're going to get in the final gather. And so for rendering a still, I don't mind pumping those numbers up. So the test renders for this scene at 720p or 1280 by 720 take about 10 minutes to render, so not very long. But the 4K image that I have in Photoshop, because again, this is big and 4K, this took 4 hours to render. And the reason it took 4 hours to render is because when I do test renders, my sampling is only at 0 or 1. So bumping that up obviously increases your render time a bit to get a smoother render. And then the big thing that affects the render time is the final gather settings. So specifically point density. But for an animation, you won't really notice a difference by having lower final gather settings. But for a still where you're kind of nitpicking, it just looks nicer to have higher settings. So, but 0.5 for a 4K render is a pretty high number. So it really, really gave me a lot of detail in the final gather. But that's what made it take 4 hours to render. So if I had left the point density at 0.1 and the accuracy at 50, then my 4K render probably only would have taken maybe 40 minutes. But it wouldn't have so much nice contact shadows between objects in the final gather. It's something that just looks a lot nicer. So those are the settings I used for rendering that 4K render. So as far as these other scenes that I have in here for fog and Z-depth, we talk about this thoroughly in, I think, DVD, maybe DVD 1 also, but definitely DVD 2 and DVD 3 on our grass instancer and our Paint Effects trees scene. I talk thoroughly about how to render Z-depth and how to render fog. And so it's exactly the same technique. So if I open the Z-depth file, what we're going to see is that I've assigned a Lambert shader to all of my objects, and I have which causes all of my objects to render as a solid white, and then I have black environment fog. And so that's what this scene is. So you can see all of my objects that do not have cutout opacity just have this Lambert shader that just has color black and incandescence at white. So they just render as a solid white. All of the things that have leaves inside here, you can see I'm taking the out transparency and plugging that into transparency. And then I'm taking the inverse of the out transparency and plugging that into incandescence. So I get something that creates a solid white incandescence just where the leaf is. And then I have black fog in the scene. And so what that gives me is my Z-depth. And so we can see this is what the Z-depth looks like for this scene. And it renders really fast. At 4K, it probably took, under 10 minutes because there's no lighting, there's no shadows, there's no complex shaders, so it just renders really, really quick. And then I've got my fog, and just like in the last DVD, I take all of these same shaders I made for Z-depth, and I set their matte opacity to black hole, and then turn on some volume primitives in my scene. And the volume primitives are creating true volumetric shadows, and so it's accurate fog. And so in here, you can see it's the same shaders as a Z-depth scene, but the matte opacity is set to black hole on all my shaders. That causes all of them to render as solid black, and therefore my fog, which is inside here, which is this volume primitive, can then render with black objects. And so if we go into Photoshop and I open one of the fog passes, we can see what that looks like. So this shadow that I'm getting right here, right there, you wouldn't get with normal environment fog, because normal environment fog in Maya does not react to lighting and doesn't cast volumetric shadows, but volume primitives do. And so that's awesome. So I got this nice fog pass, and I did a couple renders of the fog, just moving the volume primitive around. So this one's just bringing it a little bit closer, and I still get this nice light ray inside there. So that's pretty much it. And so the last thing to mention with this scene is just I rendered out these passes, and then I comped them together. And so let's get out of Maya for a second. And let's jump to After Effects. So I'm just going to close out this stuff, close out this. And so what we're looking at in Photoshop are comps where I utilized all these different passes to make these different images, where I could, put in my own sky and the light rays and color correct it. But I actually do it in After Effects, even for a still, as opposed to Photoshop. And that's just because After Effects is non-destructive. So let's just open up that comp real quick. All right, so now I'm in After Effects with my comp. And so basically what I have inside here is you can see that if I double click on just the straight render, which is that. So here I've got, and let's just move that into there. And let's look at that footage. So this is the Beauty Pass render. And so we can see that it has an alpha channel because I turned use background on for the sky. And this is just a straight beauty pass, meaning it's got diffuse, reflection, and shadows. And then that in this composition basically gets dragged in with its alpha channel set to pre-multiply. And you can see I just plopped in some clouds in the background. And so I have a library, or I have a bunch of, stuff in my reference library and maps library of different skies from all sorts of different libraries and Google searches and whatever. So I just tried that one out and it looked okay. And then there's the Beauty Pass. And then on top of that, you can see I plopped in fog A, B, and C, but I only used B. And so if I set that to normal, you'll see there's the fog. And instead of having it set to normal, I set it to screen, so it screens on top of what's underneath it, so I can turn it off or turn it on. And so clearly you can see I color corrected the fog. So you can see I added a HSV node and a levels node. So if I set the fog to normal, you can see what these are doing. So this is what the fog looks like by default. I colorized it, make it a little orange. I adjusted levels to make it a little brighter. And then there it is. So it's subtle, but it's in there. And then also on my Beauty Pass layer, I have some Z-Fog. So I use this is a Sapphire plugin. So I have Magic Bullet, Frischluft Lens Care, Revision for Real Smart Motion Blur, and Sapphire. Those are the plugins I use with After Effects. And these are all awesome, and I highly recommend getting them. They're expensive, but they're really cool. And Sapphire has one called, it's at the bottom here, you can't see it, Z-Fog. And so I add Z-Fog where I can specify my Z-depth pass, and then basically I can specify near and far points for the fog. So you can see I have my density at 0.3, but I can go in here and play with that. Wait for it to wake up. So interactively. So while I have my volumetric fog creating the light ray, I also wanted some general fog in the scene that's just a little bit everywhere. And so that's what I use this for via the Z-depth pass. So I can adjust the intensity of that. So I kept it real low, around 0.3. So if I turn that off and turn it on, you can see it's just adding a little extra fog into the scene. Then on my clouds in the background, you can see I adjusted levels and color on them. So barely changed the color, but adjust the brightness on the clouds a little. And then I took this entire comp, which was Highway 4K, and then I dragged this to make a new composition with that composition in it, which is what this is. And so basically that comp is in there, and then I add some effects to it. That's where I add my depth of field, some glow, and Magic Bullet looks, and Magic Bullet Mojo. So I like to do it this way because basically I use my first comp just to get my fog effects finalized, and then with all of that baked together, this is basically like a flattened version of this comp. where I can add effects to an entire composite in After Effects. And so my depth of field I add first. So that's with Frischluft. So I'm adding a very, very subtle depth of field inside here. So if we look in the background, you can see if I turn that off, they get a little sharper. Turn it on, just a little subtle depth of field in the background. So, which was enough for me. So obviously I can go in here and put the radius to 20 and get a lot more blur, but I still wanted to be able to see the detail. So now it's way more blurred back there, but that's not what I wanted. And then I added a glow node, so you can see this is glowing the brightest points in the image. So if I turn that off or turn it back on, really, really subtle. It's just adding inside here. We can see if I turn the glow back on, it's just glowing the sky into the edges of the trees a little bit. And then from that point on, it's color grading, meaning just trying to create a final style. Because if I turn off these two nodes, all I end up at this point is my straight render with some fog, a sky, and depth of field, a little bit of glow. So these nodes are me experimenting with different looks. And so like this one right here, we can see is a different style. This one here is adding some lens distortion as well as chromatic aberration onto the edges of the image, while this one is creating another look. That one looks kind of neat. Let's go to 50%. So I've gone through all of these plugins on all of the different DVDs, and so all of this, a lot of this right now is review, but I think hopefully it's useful to see this kind of stuff in different examples and different scenes. So everything that's happening in here, I did the exact same thing with my other project, meaning the one where we have the overgrowth on the ground. And it's the exact same setup inside here. And so what we'll see is that I've got my pre-comp. So you can see I imported a few different types of clouds until I found the one that I wanted. So inside here, you can see I've got my Z-depth pass is in there just because it has to be, but it's off. I've got a white solid in there that I put behind my render, but of course it got covered with a sky. You can see I've got different types of clouds. So I've got that one, I've got that one, I've got that one, and then finally, for now, I like this one. And these cloud files that I'm bringing in are huge. So you can see it's 13,000 by 3,200 pixels. These are from a hyperfocal design, and they're super high res. They're meant to be used as hemispherical panoramas to map onto spheres in 3D for skies. And you need them to be that high res if you're doing sky domes in 3D scenes, especially if you're rendering at 2K. And so it's really big, but that's great for my 4K comp. So I just, you can see if I zoom out how big that image is and what region of the clouds I'm using. And then I've got my beauty pass. And then again, you can see I added some fog inside there. And on my beauty pass, which is this guy, we can see again, I added some fog through the Z-depth, so it's unified fog everywhere. And then I took this composition and flattened it into its own comp. And then in this comp is where I did my final look. And so meaning adding depth of field and chromatic aberration and color correction, and then just making things a little more yellow. So if we zoom inside here, so with my depth of field, you can see I have it set very low at 2, and my focal point is this sign. So that's what's in focus. And so the cool thing is you can go to select depth and click that little button and just click in the image where you want to be in focus, and it'll make that in focus. So that's cool. So if I go to my radius, just like I mentioned before, if I put this to 30, obviously I can get a much shallower depth of field in my image, but then all of the detail all over the place gets killed. So it's neat. So you can see it looks really cool. So zoom out a little bit. And so now I've got this very, very shallow depth of field in here with these nice little bokeh blooming highlights. So that's what's great about the Lens Care plugin, is that it creates these little blooming highlights for you, which look really natural and realistic. So it's neat looking with the shallow depth of field, but for the purposes of a still, it's just stylistic for me to have it be low. So I think that, when you put a bunch of detail in a scene, it's kind of a bummer when it all gets blurred out. But that's often the difference between working on your own stuff and working in production. So I know a lot of people who've spent a ton of time modeling things and texturing things, and then they see the final shot and it's all motion blurred and depth of field, and it's just like so much work is just obliterated by the compositor. But that's just the decision of the director to get the final look they want, because they're not attached to all the details and the models and the textures like you are. So they make the best decision in the end. But here I just wanted to keep the depth of field low. Rambling, but hopefully that made some level of sense. And then for the looks, again, I have one which is creating just a little bit of chromatic aberration and lens distortion. And then this one is just color grading. So you can see just boosting contrast. And then selective color, this one's really subtle. This one just makes things a little bit more yellow. I mean, you can barely notice, but I can see a shift. So that is how this highway scene came together. So it's something that just started with me wanting to mess around with a bunch of onyx trees, and just started building a scene. And there you go. So cool. So now that we've talked about onyx broadleaf and trees and bushes and how to create the shaders for them and how to use physical sun and sky and create a scene like this, now we're going to move on from broadleaf. We still have onyx pine, palm, and bamboo to talk about, as well as mental ray proxies. So for pine and palm and bamboo, we'll obviously look at the tools, and we'll talk about how to create believable shaders for those different kinds of trees and their leaves, and then we'll use proxies for rendering billions of polygons. So cool, but that pretty much wraps up the highway scene. So let's move on to something else.